the Julian Calendar, and the chronology of Caesar's invasions of Britain. The chronology of Caesar's first invasion of Britain is simple enough, so far as it can be ascertained, and requires no knowledge of the intricacies of the Roman calendar. I have shown in an earlier article that the disembarkation took place on the 26th or 27th of August, 55 BC, after describing the storm which occurred on the night of August 30-31, and the consequent loss of many of his ships. Caesar goes on to say that the Britons endeavored to protract the war by cutting off his supplies, and that he had corn brought in daily from the open country into his camp, and ordered the materials necessary for the repair of those ships, which were only partially damaged, to be fetched from the continent. While the ships were being repaired, an attack was made upon the 7th Legion, which was engaged in cutting corn. This attack evidently took place several days after the 31st of August, for the field in which the legion was reaping was the only one accessible from the camp in which the corn had not been cut. The day on which the legion was attacked was followed by several days of stormy weather, during which all military operations were suspended. At the end of this time, the Britons attacked the camp unsuccessfully, and on the same day sued for peace, which Caesar granted on condition of their giving hostages. Instead of waiting for the arrival of the hostages, he ordered the British chiefs to send them over to the continent, because the equinox was at hand, and he did not think it wise to expose his unseaworthy ships to a voyage in stormy weather. The equinox occurred on the 26th of September. Our data, then, are as follows. The attack on the 7th Legion occurred several days after the 31st of August, and Caesar returned to Gaul several days after the attack on the 7th Legion, but before probably several days before the 26th of September. Let us say that he returned about the middle of the month. Napoleon, to whom indefiniteness was an abomination, fixed the 12th of September as the date. Roman 2. If we were to believe certain writers of high reputation, we should be deterred from attempting to fix any dates for the second of Caesar's expeditions, for our principal sources of information are dates mentioned by Cicero in his letters. And, as everybody knows, the Roman calendar, before Caesar's reform, was often in disagreement with the Julian calendar. The writers of the article Calendarium in Smith's Dictionary of Greek and Roman Antiquities affirm that it is very difficult, or rather quite impossible, to determine the actual dates, which correspond to the nominal dates of any events before the Julian reform of the calendar. But for the period comprised between the beginning of the year 696, 58 BC, just after Caesar became governor of Gaul, and his reform of the calendar, which took effect in 709, 45 BC, this view is quite incorrect. Every date in Cicero's correspondence which relates to the subject of this essay can be reduced, if not with absolute precision, at all events with a possible error of not more than one day, to its corresponding date in the Julian calendar. First of all, however, we must find out the nature of the reform which Caesar initiated, and understand the chronological disturbances which made reform necessary. Every scholar knows that, after the period of the decemvirate, the Roman year consisted of 355 days only, and that every other year an additional month, consisting alternately of 22 and 23 days, was, or rather ought to have been, intercalated after the 23rd of February. January, April, June, August, September, November, and December each contained 29 days, February 28, and March, May, July, and October 31. If I may remind the general reader of what he learned at school, the first day of every month was called the calends, the 5th day of January, February, April, June, August, September, November, and December was called the nones, and the 13th day of each of those months was called the ides. But in March, May, July, and October the nones were on the 7th, and the ides on the 15th day. In mentioning dates, the Romans described any given day as occurring so many days before the calends, nones, or ides, as the case might be, and in so doing they adopted the inclusive method of reckoning. Thus the last day of December was called the day before the calends of January, pridi calendas Ianuarias, or shortly prid. Cal. Ian. But the 27th of December was called, not the 3rd, but the 4th day before the calends of January, ante diem quartum calendas Ianuarias, or shortly AD Roman for Cal. Ian. To return to the month, which was or ought to have been intercalated every other year. As the ordinary year contained 355 days, and the solar year was believed to contain 365 a quarter days, it is obvious that to intercalate a month of 22 and 23 days alternately every other year was to make an excessive correction, the excess amounting to 4 days in every period of 4 years. Macrobius tells us that in order to remedy this error, 24 days were omitted from every 24th year. For various reasons, however, this regulation, if indeed it ever really took effect, was not always properly carried out. And accordingly, in the year of the city 563 or 191 BC, a reform was introduced, the College of Pontiffs being authorized to intercalate or to omit intercalations at their discretion. But this innovation, as we learn from Cicero, Censorinus, and other writers, only made matters worse. Speaking of the pontiffs, Censorinus complains that most of them, either from hatred or from favor, to cut short or to extend the tenure of office, or that a farmer of the public revenue might gain or lose more by the length of the year, by intercalating more or less at their pleasure, deliberately made worse what had been entrusted to them to set right. Roman 3. In 708, 46 BC, which is generally called the Year of Confusion, Caesar intercalated a certain number of days in order to bring the calendar into harmony with the solar year before inaugurating the reformed calendar in 709. It is expressly stated by Asconius, whose testimony is unanimously accepted, that there was an intercalary month in 702, and it is admitted by all chronologists that there was no other intercalary month in the 7 years between 700 and 708. There is no doubt that the kalends of January, 709, corresponded either with the 1st or the 2nd of January, 45 BC. It is clear, therefore, that when we have ascertained how many days were intercalated in 708, we shall be able, by reckoning backwards, to ascertain the correspondence of any given date in the summer of 700, the year of Caesar's second expedition, with the Julian calendar with a possible error of 1 day only. This error will be removed if we can ascertain whether the kalends of January, 709, corresponded with the 1st or the 2nd of January, 45 BC. All German scholars who have written upon Roman chronology are agreed that the Year of Confusion contained 445 days, in other words, that 90 days, amounting to 4 ordinary intercalary months, were intercalated. And they hold that these 90 days were actually composed of 3 months, namely the Mercedonius, which, in the ordinary course, should in that year have been intercalated immediately after the 23rd of February, and 2 extraordinary months, amounting to 67 days, which were intercalated between the last day of November and the 1st of December. This view is supported in every detail by Censorinus, who wrote about 240 AD. The principal dissentients are de la Noz, Napoleon III and his collaborator, the famous astronomer Leverrier, who held that 67 days only were intercalated in 708, and Colonel Stoffel, who, in his Histoire de Jules César Guerre Civile, published in 1887, reaffirmed the same view, but who does not appear to have informed himself of what any of the Germans, except Idler, had written on the subject. Moreover, the theory of Napoleon Leverrier and Colonel Stoffel is frequently referred to by scholars in terms which imply that they regard the question as still open. The reason which Leverrier gives is that in 700, Caesar re-embarked his troops for the return voyage from Britain to Gaul, because the equinox was at hand, quod equinoctium suberat, that the equinox actually took place on the 26th of September of the Julian calendar, and that Caesar informed Cicero on the 6th day before the kalends of October, which corresponded, on Leverrier's theory, with the 21st of September, that he was on the point of bringing back the army. He remarks that, on the theory of Idler, who, like all other German scholars, held that 90 days were intercalated in 708, the 6th day before the kalends of October, 700, would have corresponded with the 30th of August, 54 BC. And he argues that this theory must be wrong because Caesar would not have troubled himself about the approach of the equinox 27 days before it occurred. He also remarks that, although the view that 90 days were intercalated in 708 is supported by Suetonius and Censorinus, Dion Cassius affirmed that 67 days were intercalated, and that Dion expressly added that other writers had asserted that a greater number had been intercalated, but that his own statement was true, and he insists that Dion derived his information from authentic sources. It will be shown presently that if Leverrier was right in his interpretation of Dion's words, Dion made a mistake. G.F. Unger holds that he misunderstood the authority from whom he borrowed his statement, and who, like Suetonius, unquestionably regarded the month intercalated in February as an ordinary intercalary month. Von Goller, on the other hand, holds that Dion was quite right, that he was referring not to the ordinary intercalary month, but only to the two extraordinary months intercalated between November and December, which amounted to 67 days, and therefore that his statement tallies with that of Censorinus. Be this, however, as it may, it is absolutely certain that more than 67 days were intercalated in 708. For on the 16th of May, 705, Cicero wrote from Cumae, "At present the equinox is delaying us, which has been very stormy, nunc quaedam equinoctium nos moratur, quod valda perturbatum erat." Now, on Leverrier's theory, the 16th of May, 705, corresponded with the 16th of April, 49 BC of the Julian calendar, but the equinox occurred on the 24th of March. In order to dispose of this difficulty, Leverrier is obliged to have recourse to flagrant special pleading. L'équinoxe, he says, etate passé depuis 21 jours, et les troubles atmosphériques pouvaient durer encore. Etate si dès lors autre chose qu'un prétexte pour Cicéron? A very thin pretext, one would say, a pretext which a man of Cicero's intelligence was hardly likely to resort to. But this is not the only proof of the unsoundness of Leverrier's theory. The argument which he bases upon Caesar's words, quod equinoctium suberat, shows that he completely misunderstands both Caesar's narrative and the letter of Cicero to which he appeals. Cicero writes, "On the 24th of October, I received letters from my brother Quintus and from Caesar, dated from the nearest coasts of Britain on the 25th of September. They were on the point of bringing back the army, a quinto frater et a Caesar except A.D. Roman 9 cal, nav, litteras, datas a litoribus Britanniae proximus, A.D. Roman 6 cal, October, exercitum Britannia reportabant." The letters to which Cicero refers were written, according to Napoleon and Leverrier, on the 21st of September of the Julian calendar, and they triumphantly remark this tallies with Caesar's statement that he hurried on his departure from Britain because the equinox was at hand. But there is one fact which they overlook. Caesar had a large number of hostages and prisoners, and some of his ships had been lost. He was therefore obliged to transport the hostages, prisoners, and troops to Gaul in 2 successive trips. Only a few of the ships which made the first trip ever returned to Britain, almost all the rest having been driven back to Gaul by adverse winds. Caesar tells us that he waited for these ships, a considerable time, aliquamdio, in vain. Then, and not till then, he made the second trip, being obliged to crowd the soldiers into the few ships that he had, and not daring to wait any longer, because the equinox was at hand. The letters to which Cicero refers were evidently written before the first trip, for neither Caesar nor Quintus had written to Cicero for a long time, and they would naturally have dispatched their letters by one of the ships which made the first voyage. It is clear, therefore, that the letters in question were written, not on the 21st of September of the Reformed calendar, but a considerable time before that day. In fine, if Leverrier and Napoleon were right, the letters would have been written not from Britain but from Gaul, and Cicero would have written not reportabant, they were on the point of bringing back, but reportaverant, they had brought back. Another fact, which Napoleon, Leverrier, and Colonel Stoffel appear to have overlooked, alone proves that not 67 days only, but 90 days were intercalated in that year. The word nundini is familiar to many readers of Cicero's letters. To quote the authors of the article Nundini in Smith's Dictionary of Greek and Roman Antiquities, the Romans had a system of 8-day weeks, which, like our 7-day weeks, ran on from one month to another and from one year to another without breaking. Every 8th day was a market day and was called nundini. Thus, if the 1st of January was a market day, the next was the 9th, the next the 17th, and so on. We learn from Dion Cassius that the calends of January, 702, was a market day. The same writer says that, in order to prevent the calends of January, 714, from falling on a market day, a coincidence, which was regarded as ill-omened. A day was intercalated extraordinarily in 713. And it follows that, if there had been no intercalation in 713, the number of days that elapsed from the kalends of January, 702, to the last day of December, 713, would have been a multiple of 8. Now, on the theory of Napoleon III, Leverrier, and Colonel Stoffel, this number would have been 4,401. On the theory that the year 708 contained 445 days, 424. The latter number is divisible by 8, the former is not. There has never been any question but that the number of days intercalated in 708 was either 67 or 90, and the former number has been proved to be wrong. Roman 4. In order to obtain an absolutely firm foundation for the chronology of Caesar's second expedition, one more question remains to be answered. In this country, it is generally taken for granted that the kalends of January, 709, the year in which Caesar's reform of the calendar came into operation, corresponded with the 1st of January, 45 B.C. Various German scholars have, however, attempted to prove that the kalends of January, 709, fell on the 2nd of January of the Julian calendar. Let us first see what there is to be learned from the ancient writers. Pliny says that, when the error in the execution of Caesar's reform was discovered, it was corrected by the omission of intercalary days during 12 successive years. Solinus tells us that Caesar's reform was vitiated by the pontiffs. For, whereas it had been enjoined that a day should be intercalated on the completion of the 4th year, they made the intercalation at the beginning of the 4th year, not at the end. Thus, Solinus continues, 12 days were intercalated in 36 years, whereas only 9 ought to have been intercalated. Suetonius says that the calendar, as reformed by Caesar, was thrown into confusion by negligence, and rectified by Augustus. Also that Caesar made the calendar year consist of 365 days, so as to bring it into harmony with the solar year, and, abolishing the intercalary month, ordered that one day should be intercalated every 4th year. According to Censorinus, Caesar directed that, in order to compensate for the quarter of a day by which the solar exceeded the calendar year, one day should be intercalated at the end of every quadriennial cycle, after the terminalia, that is to say, after the 23rd of February. According to Macrobius, Caesar directed that one day should be intercalated every 4th year. Macrobius then makes substantially the same charge against the pontiffs as Solinus, and goes on to say that, after the error for which they were responsible had continued for 36 years, Augustus corrected it by ordering that 12 years should pass without any intercalation. Now it is absolutely certain that of the first 5 years during which the reformed calendar was in force, namely 709, 710, 711, 712, and 713, not one only but 2 contained an intercalary day. For, as we have already seen, Dion Cassius states that the kalends of January, 702, was a market day, and also that, in order to prevent the kalends of January, 714, from falling on a market day, a day was intercalated extraordinarily. Pi alpha rho letter 1 F70 tau letter 1 F70 kappa alpha theta epsilon sigma tau eta kappa letter 1 F79 tau alpha in 713. And as I had occasion to remark before, it follows that, if there had been no intercalation in 713, the number of days that elapsed from the kalends of January, 702, to the last day of December, 713, would have been a multiple of 8. This would have been the case if one of the 4 years 709, 710, 711, and 712 had contained an intercalary day, but not otherwise. Which was it? The year 711 may be set aside at once. Nobody has ever argued that it was a leap year, and no reason can be given to show that it was. 1 Wilhelm Soltau, the author of a valuable work on Roman chronology, maintains that 709 was the first leap year of the reformed calendar. He argues that Matsat's theory, according to which an intercalation occurred in 710, must be wrong, because it is inconceivable that Caesar, who was then alive, should have allowed an intercalation to take place in the 2nd year of his calendar, in defiance of his own edict, that the intercalation should be made every 4th year, quarto quoque anno intercalendum esse. The theory that the first intercalation was in 712 is, Soltau continues, based only upon the statements, derived from the same source, of Solinus and Macrobius. If, says Soltau, they are right, the leap years, before Augustus rectified the error which had been made in carrying out Caesar's intentions, would have been 712, 715, 718, 721, 724, 727, 730, 733, 736, 739, 742, and 745. But Dion's statement that 713 was an intercalary year proves that this cannot have been the case. The series must therefore have been 709, 713, 716, 719, 743. Soltau holds that the 12 years during which intercalation was, by the order of Augustus, suspended, lasted from 745 to 756. That Augustus disapproved of Caesar's assumed anticipatory method of reckoning, that is to say, of his having intercalated a day in the first year of his calendar instead of after the conclusion of the fourth. That accordingly the next intercalation, which would naturally have taken place in 757, was omitted. And that the first intercalation after the reform of Augustus occurred in 761. Thus, like other writers who differ from him on points of detail, Soltau identifies the kalends of January, 709, with the 2nd of January, 45 BC. It will presently be shown that the statements of Macrobius and Solinus do not necessarily lead to the conclusion which Soltau condemns. Meanwhile, I may remark that Soltau's theory is irreconcilable with the very passage in Dion Cassius to which he refers. Dion says that a day was intercalated extraordinarily. Pi alpha rho letter 1 F70, tau letter 1 F70, kappa alpha theta epsilon sigma tau, eta kappa letter 1 F79 tau alpha in 713, in order to prevent New Year's Day in 714 from falling on a market day, and that subsequently an intercalary day was struck out. It is therefore obvious that the intercalation of 713 took place earlier than had been contemplated, and consequently that the previous intercalation must have occurred later than 709. For if, as Soltau maintains, the previous intercalation had taken place in 709, the intercalation of 713 took place at the proper time. If, on the other hand, Dion's words, pi alpha rho letter 1 F70, tau letter 1 F70, kappa alpha theta epsilon sigma tau eta kappa letter 1 F79 tau alpha, mean contrary to the regulations erroneously attributed to Caesar by the pontiffs, that is to say, contrary to the triennial cycle which they themselves followed, the intercalation on Soltau's theory took place a year too late. For if the first intercalation had occurred in 709, the object which Dion mentions could have been attained by intercalating in 712. 2. Let us now examine the theory of Matsat, namely, that the first intercalation took place in 710. This writer believes that Caesar's reason for intercalating in 710 was to prevent the kalends of January in the following year from falling on a market day. He holds that Dion's words, pi alpha rho alpha tau alpha kappa alpha theta epsilon sigma tau eta kappa omicron tau alpha, mean contrary to the actual regulations of Caesar, and accordingly he believes that those regulations were at the time understood. He maintains, however, that after 713, the pontiffs intercalated every 3 years, namely in 716, 719, 722, 743. But he insists that they did this simply for the same reason which had prompted the intercalation in 713, namely to prevent the kalends of January in each following year from falling on a market day. The statement of Dion that, in order to compensate for the day extraordinarily intercalated in 713, another intercalary day was omitted, he takes to mean that the next intercalation, which, on his theory, ought to have occurred in 714, was left out. Finally, he believes that the 3 superfluous days which had accumulated during the 12 triennial cycles were compensated for by the omission of all intercalations in the years 740, 57, 56, and that the first intercalation under the reform of Augustus occurred in 757. On this theory, the kalends of January, 709, corresponded with the 1st of January, 45 BC. I have already mentioned the objection which Soltau has brought against Matset's theory, but that objection is inconclusive. It is not true that if Caesar had allowed an intercalation to take place in 710, he would have done so, in defiance of his own edict, that the intercalation should be made every 4th year, quarto quoque anno intercalerator. If, according to his scheme, the next intercalation was to take place in 714, the next in 718, and so on, the intercalation would still be made every 4th year. Provided it took place every 4 years, what difference would it make whether it took place first in 709, 710, 711, 712, or 713? Halsapfel blames Matset for disregarding the testimony of Solinus and Macrobius, but Matset does not disregard their testimony. He simply refuses to admit that they make any definite statement as to the year in which the first intercalation of the Julian calendar occurred. The only statement which would appear to support Halsapfel's criticism is contained in the words of Solinus, that, whereas it had been enjoined that they should intercalate one day in the 4th year, and this ordinance ought to have been carried out on the completion of the 4th year, they intercalated at the beginning of the 4th year, not at the end. Nam cum preceptum esset, anno quarto ut intercalerant annum diem, et operatorit confecto quarto anno id observari. Illi incipient quarto intercalerant, non designant. If by the beginning of the 4th year, Solinus meant the 4th year of the Julian calendar, that is to say, 712, and if he had original authority for his statement, then Halsapfel is right. But observe the looseness with which Solinus expresses himself. Immediately after saying that the intercalation ought to have taken place in the 4th year, he says that it ought to have taken place on the completion of the 4th year. To state the facts correctly required extraordinary precision and nicety of expression, and this requirement he failed to satisfy. His meaning may have been that, in whatever year of the Julian calendar the first intercalation took place, the next ought, by Caesar's ordinance, to have taken place 4 years later, and so on. If it be objected that I have suggested an arbitrary interpretation of his meaning, I reply that this interpretation is dictated by the passage in which Dion Cassius states that the intercalation of 713 was contrary to the regulations. Pi alpha rho letter 1 F70, tau letter 1 F70, kappa alpha theta, epsilon sigma tau, eta kappa letter 1 F79 tau alpha. Halsapfel says that these words, taken by themselves, may mean one of two things. They may mean that the intercalation of 713 was contrary to the actual regulations of Caesar, or they may mean that it was contrary to the regulations adopted by the pontiffs in misunderstanding or in contravention of Caesar's regulations. The question, says Halsapfel, can only be settled by other evidence, and the only other evidence is that of Solinus and Macrobius, which shows that the pontiffs misunderstood Caesar's regulations. As a matter of fact, their evidence does not show this, unless misunderstanding is connoted by the words vidium and error. Matset contends that such a misunderstanding would have been impossible, for Caesar must have made his intentions clear. Halsapfel replies that Caesar would no doubt have done so if he had foreseen his own imminent death. But, as he certainly intended, in his capacity as Pontifex Maximus, to superintend the execution of his own arrangements, and thus establish the rule of intercalation which he contemplated, the regulation ut quarto quoque anno intercalerator might seem sufficient. But Dion Cassius, if his testimony may be accepted, settles the question. Immediately after saying that a day was extraordinarily intercalated in 713, he adds that, of course, an intercalary day was in turn omitted, in order that the calendar might be brought into harmony with Caesar's intentions. Kappa alpha letter 1 F76, delta letter 1 FC6, lambda omicron nu letter 1 F45 tau iota, letter 1 F00, nu theta upsilon phi letter 1 FC3, rho letter 1 F73, theta eta alpha letter 1 F56, theta iota sigma. Letter 1 F45 pi omega sigma, letter 1 F41 chi rho letter 1 F79, nu omicron sigma kappa alpha tau, letter 1 F70 tau, letter 1 F70 tau, letter 1 FF7 kappa alpha, letter 1 F77, sigma alpha rho iota tau, letter 1 FF7, pi rho omicron tau, letter 1 F73, rho letter 1 FF3, delta letter 1 F79, Xi alpha nu tau alpha sigma upsilon mu beta letter 1 FC7. Now these words, as Matzet unanswerably argues, prove that by pi alpha rho letter 1 F70, tau letter 1 F70, kappa alpha theta epsilon sigma tau, eta kappa letter 1 F79 tau alpha dion meant, contrary to the regulations, actually made by Caesar. Hallzapfel, however, tries to explain away Dion's remark by the argument that the authority whom he followed may have been a contemporary who shared the misconception of the pontiffs, and this I cannot gainsay. Moreover, although I have argued that the words of Solinus may be interpreted in a sense different from that which Hallzapfel ascribes to them, I admit that the conclusion which they suggest is that Caesar intended to make his first intercalation in 713, and that the pontiffs made it in 712. Secondly, it is expressly stated by Macrobius that the calends of January in the year of the Lepidionus tumultus fell on a market day. And if, as Hallzapfel maintains, this statement refers to the Lepidus who, as one of the triumvirs, revived Sulla's policy of prescription in 711, it proves that no intercalation occurred either in 710 or in 709. Matzet, however, maintains that the words Lepidionus tumultus designate the outburst of Lepidus in 676, 78b. C. Unger, who agrees with Hallzapfel, maintains that the official recognition of the superstitious dread with which the Roman populace contemplated the coincidence of the calends of January with a market day was due to the acts of Lepidus in 711. But replies Matzet, for this official recognition, the approbation of the Pontifex Maximus was necessary. Now in 713, as in 711, the Pontifex Maximus was Lepidus himself, and, according to Macrobius, it was the Lepidionus tumultus which strengthened the popular belief that whenever the calends of January fell upon a market day, the whole year would be darkened by ill-omened events. If then, says Matzet, we are to believe Unger, Lepidus described the deeds which he had himself done in 711, and by which the joint supremacy of himself and the other two triumvirs had been established, as a tumultus, the most horrible events of a year full of horrors. This argument is clever, but I think that it is hardly fair. Lepidus was not obliged to describe anything. Assuming that the calends of January, 711, had fallen on a market day, it is surely intelligible that he should have recognized the wisdom of allaying superstitious fears, even though they had been roused by his own acts, when he could do so by the simple expedient of intercalating a day in 713. I agree with Unger that there does not appear to have been anything very alarming in the affair of 677, even though Lucan describes it as Truce's lepidi modus. And, judging the question without bias on its own merits, I can only conclude that the tumultus Lepidionus was most probably the outbreak of 711. If so, the first intercalary year of the Julian calendar cannot have been either 709 or 710, but must have been 712. Thirdly, Hallzapfel points out that, if Matzet is right, the intercalary cycle introduced by Augustus did not correspond with that of Caesar. For after the reform of Augustus, the intercalary years were odd years, 761, 765, 769, and so on, while Caesar's first intercalary year is supposed by Matzet to have been 710. Or, if we reckon the quadriennial cycles contemplated by Caesar from the year 709, the intercalations, according to his regulation, would, on Matzet's theory, occur in the second, those made by Augustus in the first year of each successive cycle. All this is perfectly true, but what does it matter? The one really important point, namely, that the intercalation should take place every 4 years, was duly secured by Augustus. Whether it took place in the first, the second, the third, or the fourth year of the cycle mattered not a jot. Hallzapfel's objection is purely academic. Fourthly, says Hallzapfel, if, as Matzet maintains, Caesar's only reason for intercalating in 710 was to prevent the calends of January in the following year from falling on a market day, it is difficult to believe that Caesar should not have foreseen that, for the same reason it would be necessary to intercalate in 713, 716, and so on, that is to say, every 3 years. In other words, that it would be impossible to carry out the arrangement which he had himself made. This is certainly a reasonable objection, and Matsat has not, so far as I know, attempted to remove it. But it is perhaps conceivable that a man so busy as Caesar should have failed to look far ahead. Halsapfel argues, further, that Matsat's theory, according to which the calendar, as reformed by Augustus, was inaugurated on the 1st of January, 757 AD 4, rests upon the assumption that the first day of the intercalary cycle coincided with the first day of the civil year, whereas it was really the day after the Terminalia, that is to say, the 6th day before the kalends of March. This, he maintains, is proved, A, by the place which Caesar gave to his intercalary day, B, by the fact that the 2 months intercalated between November and December of 708 were called respectively mensis intercalaris prior and mensis intercalaris posterior, and also by the fact that, according to Dion Cassius, the number of days intercalated in that year was only 67, whereas the number of days intercalated in the civil year 708 was 90. C, by the fact that, according to Macrobius and Solinus, Caesar ordained that the intercalary day which followed the 23rd of February should be inserted at the end of the 4th and before the 5th year of the Julian calendar. Matsat summarily replies to these arguments. Referring to Macrobius, he observes, that the place which Caesar gave to the intercalary day was identical with the place which the intercalary day, whenever it occurred, had occupied before his reform, and B, that the 2 intercalary months known as mensis intercalaris prior and mensis intercalaris posterior were added to the year 708 in order that the calendar year 709 might begin on the kalends of January, and thus coincide with the consular year. If it be asked why they were called prior and posterior, although another intercalary month had preceded them, the answer is easy. The other month ought in any case to have been intercalated in that year, whereas the prior and posterior were extraordinarily intercalated. The passages in Macrobius and Solinus on which Halsapfel relies have been already explained, and it has been shown that they do not necessarily bear the meaning which he ascribes to them. One fact alone appears to me to dispose of his contention that the Julian calendar did not come into operation until the 6th day before the kalends of March, 709. If it did not, why did January in that year contain 31 days, whereas in every previous year it had contained only 29? Halsapfel also invokes the support of Bach, who remarked that it would have been unnatural for a reformer to correct the error caused by the difference of a quarter of a day between the civil and the solar year, until the error required correction. The conclusion appears to Halsapfel inevitable that Caesar intended to make his first intercalation as soon as, and not before, the error should have amounted to 1 day, that is to say, in 713. Matsat, on the contrary, maintains that logically the proper place for the intercalary day would have been immediately after the 2nd year of the quadriennial cycle. But he does not believe that Caesar cared for such academic considerations. He undoubtedly fixed the place of the intercalary day in the year not on astronomical grounds, but according to usage. Why then, asks Matsat, should it be considered improbable that he fixed the place of the intercalary year in the quadriennial cycle on the same principle? 3. Halsapfel holds, as we have just seen, that the Caesarian cycle began on the day after the Terminalia of 709, that is to say, on the 6th day before the kalends of March. That Caesar intended that the first intercalation should take place in 713. That the pontiffs, misunderstanding his directions, made the first intercalation at the beginning of the 4th year, that is to say, in 712. That, as Dion says, a day was extraordinarily intercalated in 713. That, to compensate for this extraordinary intercalation, a day was omitted in 714, which accordingly comprised 364 days only. That the pontiffs thenceforth intercalated every 3 years, namely in 715, 718, 721. 745. That, to compensate for the 3 superfluous days which had been intercalated in consequence of the misunderstanding of Caesar's regulations, the intercalations which ought to have occurred in 749, 753, and 757 were omitted, and that the first intercalation after the reform of Augustus took place in 761. This theory, as the reader will have already seen, cannot stand unless the evidence of Dion Cassius is to be rejected. Indeed, it cannot stand even then. Halsapfel is not justified in assuming that in order to compensate for the extraordinary intercalation of 713, a day was omitted in 714. For, on his own theory, 714 was an ordinary year. Matzet points out that, in the passage in which Dion describes the omission of a day to compensate for the extraordinary intercalation kappa alpha, letter 1F76, delta letter 1FC6, lambda omicron, nu letter 1F45 tau iota, letter 1F00, nu theta upsilon, phi letter 1FC3, rho letter 1F73, theta eta alpha, letter 1F56, theta iota sigma. Letter 1F45 pi omega sigma, letter 1F41 chi rho, letter 1F79, nu omicron sigma kappa alpha tau, letter 1F70 tau, letter 1F70 tau, letter 1FF7 kappa alpha, letter 1F77, sigma alpha rho iota tau, letter 1FF7, pi rho omicron tau, letter 1F73, rho letter 1FF3, delta letter 1F79, psi alpha nu tau alpha sigma upsilon mu beta, letter 1FC7 the words. Letter 1F21 mu letter 1F73 rho alpha, letter 1F10, mu beta, letter 1F79, lambda iota mu omicron sigma. An intercalary day must necessarily be supplied, as the subject of the verb letter 1F00, nu theta upsilon phi letter 1FC3, rho letter 1F73 theta eta, from the preceding sentence. Halsapfel retorts that his view does not involve the assumption of a change of subject. One can very well translate, he says, an intercalary day was inserted and self-evidently in turn omitted. Man kann säger wohl übersetzen, is Word ein Schalltag eingelegt und selbstverständlich wiederum in Abzug gebracht. This is not a satisfactory answer, for, on Halsapfel's own showing, the omitted day was not an intercalary day. There is no evidence that a day was ever withdrawn from an ordinary year in the Roman calendar. And, as Matzet points out, the best proof that such a proceeding would have been regarded as out of the question is supplied by the procedure of Augustus. Instead of correcting the error of the pontiffs by withdrawing 3 days from one ordinary year, he omitted 3 intercalary days in 3 intercalary years, thus taking 12 years to accomplish a reform which, according to modern notions, might have been accomplished in 1. If Dion's words are interpreted in their natural sense, they evidently mean that the next intercalary day which would have occurred, according to Caesar's regulations, was omitted. Thenceforth, accordingly, if the first intercalation occurred in 710, the intercalary years were 716, 719, 722, 743. Or if, as Halsapfel insists, Dion's words, pi alpha rho letter 1F70, tau letter 1F70, kappa alpha theta epsilon sigma tau eta kappa letter 1F79 tau alpha, mean, contrary to the regulations as erroneously interpreted by the pontiffs. And if, as he also insists, the year in which they first intercalated was 712, then the next year in which they would naturally have intercalated was 715. The extraordinary intercalation of 713 must have been compensated for by the omission of an intercalary day in 715. And the following series of intercalary years must have been 718, 721, 724, 745. Again, Halsapfel's theory compels him to disregard silently the testimony of Solinus, on whose authority he lays such stress. Solinus says that 12 days were intercalated in the first 36 years of the Julian calendar. According to Halsapfel, 13 were intercalated. Lastly, if we accept Halsapfel's view that the first day of the Julian calendar was the 6th day before the Kalends of March, 709, we find that a day was intercalated immediately after the end of the 4th year of the cycle, namely, after the Terminalia of 713. But Halsapfel assures us that, according to Macrobius and Solinus, this was not the case. But I am not arguing against Halsapfel's theory as regards the first intercalary year of the Julian calendar. And what appears to tell most strongly in favor of it, besides the probability that the Lepidionus tumultus occurred in 711, is the statement of Macrobius that Augustus enacted that the intercalation should take place every 5th year, quinto quoque anno. That is to say, according to our reckoning, every 4 years. These words seem to imply that the pontiffs had actually misunderstood Caesar's regulation. On Matset's theory, however, the pontiffs who intercalated pi alpha, rho letter 1f70, tau letter 1f70, kappa alpha theta epsilon, sigma tau, eta kappa letter 1f79, tau alpha in 713, deliberately set that regulation aside in order to avoid the dreaded coincidence of the kalends of January with a market day. But, says Matset, every 3 years this troublesome necessity recurred. And thus ultimately, as he suggests, the erroneous view might prevail that Caesar had himself intended to intercalate every 3 years, quarto non paracto sed incipient. But what right have we to assume that, after 713, the pontiffs took any account of the nundinal superstition? At all events, if Halsapfel is right in maintaining that the first intercalary year of the Reformed calendar was 712, there can be no doubt that the subsequent intercalary years were 713, 718, 745, and it is therefore impossible for him to reconcile his view that the first intercalation under the reform of Augustus occurred in 761, with the statement that Augustus allowed 12 years to pass without any intercalation. Augustus's first intercalation undoubtedly took place in 757, for in that year, if Caesar's regulation had been observed, the 12th intercalation would have occurred. Opinions may differ as to whether Matset's theory or the modification of Halsapfel's, which I have just suggested, is the more probable. As according to the latter, the series of intercalary years must have been 712, 713, 718, 721, 724, 727, 730, 733, 736, 739, 742, 745. It implies that after 713, the pontiffs thought it safe to disregard the nundinal superstition. So far my suggestion may be objectionable. On the other hand, it fits in with all the statements of the ancient writers, except that one remark of Dion Cassius which, as Halsapfel suggests, he may have made on erroneous information. And particularly it fits in, as no other series which has been suggested does, with the statements that 12 days were intercalated in the first 36 years of the Julian calendar, and that Augustus allowed the next 12 years to pass without any intercalation. However, the difference between Matset's theory and mine, which is purely tentative, is unimportant, for they agree in the main point that the kalends of January, 709, corresponded with the 1st of January, 45 BC. We have now gained the knowledge which will enable us to investigate the chronology of Caesar's second invasion of Britain. We have ascertained that the kalends of January, 709, fell on the 1st of January, 45 BC, that 90 days were intercalated in 708, which accordingly consisted of 445 days, that a month of 23 days was intercalated in 702, which accordingly comprised 378 days, and that 701, 703, 704, 705, 706, and 707 were ordinary years, each comprising 355 days. It follows that the last day of 700, the year in which Caesar made his second expedition to Britain, corresponded with the 30th of November, 54 BC, and that the 6th day before the kalends of October, the day on which he wrote to tell Cicero that he was on the point of bringing back his army from Britain to Gaul, corresponded with the 29th of August. From these data, it will be easy to ascertain the correspondence of any date in the year 700, which we find in our authorities with the Julian calendar. After quitting Cisalpine Gaul, Caesar returned to his army, which had wintered in the country of the Belgae. He made a tour of inspection, visiting the various camps, which were of course in the immediate neighborhood of the yards where the legionaries had been building the ships for his intended expedition, that is to say, at the Portus Itius, Boulogne, and probably on the estuaries of the Canche, the Authie, the Somme, and the Seine. After ordering all the ships to assemble at the Portus Itius, he started with 4 legions in light marching order and 800 cavalry for the country of the Treveri, which, roughly speaking, comprised the greater part of the province of Luxembourg, the Grand Duchy of Luxembourg, and the southern part of Rhenish Prussia. 2 chiefs of this people, named Cingetorix and Indudiamaris, were struggling for supremacy. Cingetorix at once presented himself before Caesar and promised fidelity. Indutiomarus collected levies and prepared to fight. Many of the leading men, however, came into Caesar's camp and made terms for themselves. Indutiomarus found that he had miscalculated his strength and hastened to excuse himself. Caesar, who had no time to spare, contented himself with taking hostages for his good behavior and returned to the Portus Itius. About 25 days after his arrival, having meantime been detained by contrary winds, he sailed for Britain. The exact date of Caesar's departure from Cisalpine Gaul is uncertain. On the 2nd of June, that is to say, the 9th of May of the Julian calendar, Cicero received at Rome a letter from his brother, written at Placentia. And on the following day he received another letter from his brother, written at Blandino, a town near Placentia, the exact site of which is not known, and also a letter from Caesar, written apparently at the same place. Napoleon, erroneously maintaining that the 2nd and the 3rd of these letters were received by Cicero on the 5th, instead of the 3rd, of June, and assuming, pour trouver le temps voulu, as he naively remarks that, in consequence of accidental delays, they took 13 days to reach Rome, concludes that Caesar quitted Blandino on the 23rd of May, which he identifies with the 22nd of the same month, but which really corresponded with the 29th of April of the Julian calendar. T. Burke, on the contrary, maintains that if there had been any delay in the transmission of the letters, Cicero would have mentioned it in his reply. And he supposes that Caesar and Quintus Cicero started on their journey for Transalpine Gaul on the 2nd of June, that is to say, on the 9th of May of the Julian calendar. All that can be safely said is that, if the letter carrier traveled at the usual rate, namely between 40 and 50 Roman miles a day, the two letters were written about the 30th of April or the 1st of May of the Julian calendar, and therefore we have no right to assume that Caesar quitted Blandino before the former day. It is possible, as we shall presently see, to fix the date of Caesar's arrival at the Portus Itius and of his voyage to Britain within a day or two. But it is plainly impossible to make any satisfactory calculation of the dates of his movements from the time when he left Blandino to the time when he left the country of the Treveri and marched for the Portus Itius. And the minute computations of Napoleon and others are simply elaborate trifling. For, although Caesar's average rate of traveling may be estimated approximately, we do not know how far he penetrated into the extensive country of the Treveri, and it is waste of time to guess how long he stayed there. This much only can be said with certainty: he did not let the grass grow under his feet. For he left Blandino about the 30th of April. He arrived, as we shall presently see, finally at the Portus Itius about the 11th of June. And in those 43 days he traveled from Blandino across the Alps and across Gaul to the English Channel, moved along the coast to various points between Boulogne and the mouth of the Seine, and marched from Boulogne to the neighborhood of Sedan, or further at least 180 miles and back again. On the 27th of July, that is to say, on the 2nd of July of the Julian calendar, Cicero wrote to Atticus, "Judging from my brother Quintus's letters, I imagine that by this time he is in Britain. XQ fratris literis suspicer eum esse in Britannia." It would be very rash, however, to infer from this that Caesar landed in Britain before, or even as early as, the 2nd of July. For, as we have seen, his embarkation was delayed by the long continuance of adverse winds. The first letter which announced the arrival of the expeditionary force in Britain was referred to by Cicero in a letter to Quintus, in which he says, "How I rejoiced at your letter from Britain. I was nervous about the sea and the coast of that island. O iucundas mihi tuas de Britannia literas. Timebam oceanum, timebam litis insuli." This letter is undated, but it must have been written some time after the one which Cicero wrote to Atticus on the 27th of July, for in the letter to Atticus we find the words, "I have undertaken to defend Messius. After that I have to prepare myself for Drusus, and then for Scaurus, Messius defendibatur a nobis. Deign me expedio ad Drusum into ad Scorum," while in the letter to Quintus Cicero wrote, "The day I write this Drusus has been acquitted." The comitia have been put off to September. Scaurus's trial will take place immediately, quo die hic scripsi, Drusus erat, absolutus, comitia in mensum septembrum reicta sunt, scori indicium statum exercebitur. Isconius tells us that the last day of Scaurus's trial was the 2nd of September. and Cicero's remark that the comitia have been put off to September makes it evident that he wrote in August. While from his saying that Scaurus's trial will take place immediately, we should naturally infer that when he wrote the 2nd of September was not far off. Letters from Britain generally reached Rome in about 27 days, and accordingly, we may conclude that the letter in which Quintus Cicero announced his arrival in Britain was written about the end of July. That is to say, about the 6th of July of the Julian calendar. Now Caesar says that the tide in the Straits of Dover turned westward soon after daybreak on the morning of his arrival in Britain, and this statement proves that he landed either about the time of full moon or about the time of new moon. There was a full moon on the 21st of July, 54 BC, and the previous new moon occurred on the 7th of July. Napoleon insists that the landing must have taken place on the day of full moon, arguing that without moonlight Caesar could not have undertaken the march which he made on the night following his arrival. But as we have already seen, Napoleon argues on the erroneous assumption that Caesar intercalated only 67 days in the year 708, and accordingly, he fixes all the dates of the unreformed calendar, which occur in Cicero's letters of 723 days too late. His argument that Caesar could not have made a night march, except by the light of the moon, is worthless. It must be remembered that, in the first half of July, there is no real night over any part of the British Isles, and no one familiar with the records of night marches would deny that Caesar could have marched on a clear night at that time of the year. Long says that, of course, he had also the moon on the night on which he sailed from the Gallic coast. There is no of course in the matter. Caesar sailed from Gaul to Britain in 55 BC after midnight, on the 26th or 27th of August. That is to say, either 5 or 4 days before the full moon. And the moon set soon after midnight both of August 25-26 and of August 26-27. Moreover, according to Napoleon himself, Caesar sailed from Britain to Gaul in 55 BC on the 12th of September, that is to say, on a moonless night. As new moon occurred on the 14th, and he did not sail until after midnight, he could not have had the benefit of moonlight unless he had deferred his voyage until the date of the equinox. And I am assured by Captain Iron, the harbor master of Dover, that on a fine night, especially in July, there would not have been the least difficulty in sailing without a moon. As a matter of fact, William the Conqueror sailed to England on a dark night. The moon, says Mr. Freeman, was hidden and the heavens were clouded over. The Duke therefore ordered every ship to bear a light. The ships were to keep as near together as might be, and to follow closely after the beacon light of his own ship. If, then, we decide that Caesar landed in Britain on the day of new moon, the 7th of July, 54 BC, we shall not be more than 1 day wrong. But to fix the date with absolute precision is impossible. As Caesar landed about the 7th of July, it follows that he had reached the Portus Itius, where he was delayed about 25 days, about the 11th of June. On the day after he landed, Caesar encountered a British force 12 miles from his camp on the coast. On the following day, while his troops were pursuing the fugitives, he was recalled to the coast by the news that a large number of his ships had been damaged by a storm. He then proceeded to construct a naval camp, and, as soon as it was finished, returned to the point from which he had started. As the construction of the camp occupied about 10 days, Surcitor X, we shall not be far wrong if we say that it was finished 12 days after the landing, that is to say, about the 19th of July of the Julian calendar. We now come to a date the significance of which has hardly been appreciated. At the close of one of his letters to Quintus, Cicero writes, "Caesar wrote me a letter from Britain on the 1st of September, in which, to prevent my wondering at not getting one from you, he tells me that you were not with him when he reached the coast. Ex Britannia Caesar ad me que September. Dedit litteres. Quibus ne admirer, quod a te nullis exceperim, scribit si sign te fuis, cum ad mere accessorit." This passage proves that Caesar had returned from the interior of Britain to the coast on or before the 1st of September, that is to say, the 5th of August of the Julian calendar. But we have already seen that he did not quit the coast after the construction of his naval camp until about the 19th of July, and that on the 29th of August he was still in Britain, on the point of bringing back the army, and did not sail for Gaul till several days later. We have to decide, then, between two alternatives. Either Caesar had finished the campaign against Cassivellaunus by the 5th of August of the Julian calendar, and thereafter remained on the coast until the 29th of August, when he was able to announce that he was on the point of bringing back the army, or he made a hurried temporary visit to the coast, the object of which remains unexplained. The latter view is not supported by the commentaries. Caesar's narrative certainly leaves the impression that, immediately after the completion of his naval camp, he resumed the military operations which had been interrupted by the shipwreck, and did not again return to the coast until the time came for him to prepare for his voyage to Gaul. He tells us that Cassivellaunus, after the failure of the attack which had been made by his orders upon the naval camp, and in consequence of the reverses which he had suffered, sued for peace, that he ordered Cassivellaunus to furnish hostages, and that, on receiving the hostages, he led back the army to the sea, where he found the ships repaired. Obsidibus acceptes exercitum reducit ad mare, naves invenit refectas. When they were launched, he continues, he determined to take the army back in 2 trips, his deductes, duobus commedibus exercitum reporter instituit. Certainly, there is not a word in this to support the view, which is advocated by Vogel, that the visit to the coast which Caesar made on the 1st of September, the 5th of August of the Julian calendar, was purely temporary, and took place before he began to march towards the country of Cassivellaunus. And the motive which Vogel suggests for the visit that Caesar wished to inspect the camp once more, and to give the necessary instructions before marching against Cassivellaunus is hardly adequate. Unless we grant Vogel's assumption that when Caesar returned to the sea, the campaign had advanced no further than the stage which he describes in the 17th chapter of his 5th book, where 3 legions under Trebonius inflicted a decisive defeat on the enemy. In other words, that Caesar returned from a point within a day's march of the sea. But this affair, according to the commentaries, took place on the very day after Caesar quitted his naval camp in order to resume the campaign, whereas he returned to the sea, on Vogel's own showing, about 17 days after he quitted the camp. If, on the other hand, we adopt Napoleon's view that Caesar, after he returned to the sea on the 1st of September, remained there until he sailed for Gaul, how are we to account for the 24 days which elapsed before he wrote to tell Cicero that he was on the point of bringing back the army? What was he doing all that time? Napoleon, indeed, maintains that, on the day on which he wrote this last letter, he actually sailed for Gaul, and Burke that he had already arrived in Gaul. But it has already been shown that both these assumptions are untenable. Moreover, in order to account for Caesar's having arrived at the sea so early, Napoleon and Burke are forced to strain the words of the commentaries, exercitum reducit ad mare, to assume that Caesar hurried on in advance of his army, and that it did not reach the coast until several days later. Although the problem cannot be definitively solved, I have no doubt but that Vogel's solution is wrong. Not only does it give the lie to Caesar's narrative, but it requires us to believe that Caesar had failed for about 17 days to make any headway against the Britons, and had been held in check by them within a dozen miles of the sea. Yet Caesar states that, in consequence of the defeat which Cassivellaunus suffered at the hands of Trebonius on the day after he left the newly constructed naval camp, the British infantry levies dispersed, and in the same breath he goes on to say that he forthwith marched for the country of Cassivellaunus. If, as Vogel implies, this statement had been false, surely Quintus Cicero would have informed his brother, in one of the 5 letters which he wrote before the 1st of September, of the real state of affairs. On the other hand, I find it difficult to believe that Caesar used the words exercitum reducit ad mare loosely, and that he remained on the coast from the 1st to the 25th of September, without once writing to Cicero between those 2 dates, and then remained several days longer before embarking. This view, indeed, would compel us to assume that he left Trebonius or one of his other generals to carry on the negotiations with Cassivellaunus, which are described in the 22nd chapter of his 5th book. Napoleon, it is true, believes that Caesar did not leave his army and hurry on in advance of it to his naval camp until the negotiations were completed and he had received his hostages from Cassivellaunus. But on this assumption, what motive could he have had, first, for hurrying on in advance of his army, and, secondly, for delaying its re-embarkation until after the lapse of several weeks? I am inclined, therefore, to believe that he made a hurried temporary visit to his naval camp, escorted probably by a small column, and then, having accomplished his purpose, returned to the main army in order to conduct or to complete the negotiations with Cassivellaunus. The motive of his visit may have been connected with the attack which the Kentish chieftains made upon the naval camp. The date of Caesar's return to Gaul can only be given approximately. We have seen that, on the 25th of September, the 29th of August of the Julian Calendar, he wrote to Cicero, saying that he was on the point of bringing back the army. Vogel remarking that, after he reached the coast, his ships had to be launched and loaded, and that he did not sail with the second detachment of troops until he had waited a long time in vain for the return of the ships which had carried the first, concludes that he did not return to Gaul until about 20 days after he wrote to Cicero, that is to say, not until the 15th of October. This date corresponds with the 17th of September of the Julian calendar, and Vogel maintains that it agrees with Caesar's statement of the reason which led him to hurry on his return, namely, that the equinox was at hand. But it is impossible to estimate, from Caesar's statement, how many days he waited for the return of his ships. Let us examine the attempts which have been made to gain a clue from Cicero's correspondence. Vogel points out that Cicero, in a letter written just after the 23rd of November, the 26th of October of the Julian calendar, referred to 2 letters which he had received from Quintus, and also to a third, which Quintus had handed to Labienus for transmission the day before he dispatched the earlier of the other 2, but which had not yet arrived. Now Labienus had remained in Gaul during the invasion of Britain. It is clear, therefore, that these 3 letters were not written until after Quintus had returned to Gaul. On the other hand, they would seem to have been the first letters which Quintus wrote to his brother after his return. For Cicero, in the letter in which he referred to them, said, "Where your Nervii dwell and how far off, I have no idea. Ubianim isti sint Nervii et quam longe absint nescio." The Nervii were the tribe in whose country Quintus, with his legion, was to pass the winter. Evidently Quintus, when he wrote the 2 letters which Cicero received, had not yet reached the country of the Nervii. For otherwise he could not, on the previous day, have been with Labienus, who was to winter in the country of another tribe. Probably, as Vogel concludes, he wrote from Samarabrava or Amiens, where Caesar had his headquarters and where the arrangements for the distribution of the legions were made. Again, in the letter which has been already quoted, Cicero wrote to Quintus, "Pray be careful to let me know to whom I am to give the letter which I shall then send you to Caesar's letter carriers, for him to forward it direct to you, or to those of Labienus. Tu velim cures ut sium quibus nos, der opertit es quas, ad te dane litteras mitimus, Caesaris ni tabulariis, ut is ad te protinus midat, and Labieni." Vogel remarks that this question is only intelligible on the hypothesis that Quintus was only just beginning to take up his quarters in Gaul, at the time when he wrote the 2 letters which Cicero had just received. Now a letter would have required about 25 days for transmission from Samarabrava to Rome, and accordingly the letters to which Cicero referred, assuming that he replied to them promptly, would have been written about the end of October. Vogel, who thinks that they must have been written within a fortnight after Quintus and Caesar returned to Gaul, infers that they cannot have returned earlier than the 15th of October, the 17th of September of the Julian calendar. His reasoning is ingenious, but unfortunately, we do not know exactly how soon after the receipt of his brother's second letter Cicero wrote, or how many days intervened between the arrival of the first and of the second. On the whole, it appears to me that all we can say for certain regarding the date of Caesar's return is this: it cannot be fixed earlier than several days after the 29th of August of the Julian calendar, the date of the letter in which he informed Cicero that he was on the point of bringing back the army. Bearing in mind that it occurred when the equinox was at hand, we may place it about the middle of September. Topographical Notes. On April 25, 1902, I observed more carefully than I had ever done before the coast between Sandgate and West Hythe. To speak of the hills between Sandgate and Hythe as Angusti Montes is sheer nonsense. Caesar would never have attempted to force a passage inland at any point between Lympne and Sandgate, nor would the Britons have abandoned these loca superioria, which lay ready to hand. There are, indeed, depressions in the line of hills, one just west of Sandgate railway station, 2 nearly opposite the Seabrook, now Imperial, Hotel, and 3 west of Hythe, just west of the point where the road diverges from the military canal. But if Caesar had attempted to force these gaps, he would have found himself entangled in the hills behind. 27.402. Quite recently I explored the easternmost and the westernmost of the 3 valleys, which partially break the continuity of the hills behind Hythe. Neither would have been practicable for an invading army. The road leading through the former, which branches off from the road to Hythe, is level for the first 120 yards, and then ascends rapidly for a short distance. Then it is tolerably level until about 100 yards before one gets to the crossroad which turns off to the left, when it ascends rapidly for a long way. A column moving along it would have been exposed to attack from the hills on either side, and particularly on the west. 3903. On the return voyage from Boulogne, I most carefully scrutinized the whole coastline between Sandgate and the Foreland, as I had often done before on land. Caesar's description of the Angusti Montes is applicable only to Shakespeare's cliff and the cliffs which extend from the Castle Hill to the neighborhood of Kingstown. It is not applicable even to the imposing heights which bound Eastware Bay, because, although they might fairly be called Angusti Montes, the missiles of which Caesar speaks could only have been thrown on to the beach from the precipitous, but low chalk cliffs which form the lowest part of these heights. Whereas he plainly means that the missiles would have been thrown by the enemy who were standing in omnibus colibus. And if he anchored off Eastware Bay, the calls were a quarter of a mile or more from the sea. The low chalk cliffs of Eastware Bay would never have been called Montes, although they are the lowest part of a range of Montes. The notion that the cliffs between Eastware Bay and Folkestone Harbor, or the cliffs on which the Lees stand, as seen from a vessel half a mile from the shore, would have been called Angusti Montes or Montes at all, is simply ludicrous. No, it is absolutely certain that Caesar's Angusti Montes were the cliffs of Dover, the cliffs between the Castle Hill and the Foreland. And as for Airy's theory, how could cliffs, 10 to 30 feet high, have been called Angusti Montes by an observer standing on the deck of a ship 5 nautical miles away? Cicero's description at Roman 4:16, section 7, of the cliffs which walled in the approaches to the island Mirificis Molibus is applicable only to the heights behind Eastware Bay and the cliffs of Dover. The following notes were jotted down on September 15, 1902, on the deck of a steamer running from Dover to Deal. 6 calls at present visible off Dover Harbor, i.e. on east of Old Harbor. 1 on left, not counting Shakespeare's Cliff. 8 from off the Foreland. Nothing could be more appropriate than the expressions in Omnibus Colibus Expositas and Montes Angusti. In the various dips, the Hostium Copii would have been very conspicuous. Behind the low rampart between Kingstown and Walmer Castle, the ground rises. Caesar might have encamped on this rising ground, or on the rising ground which extends behind the castle towards the church. Just after passing Deal Castle, one turns to the left down Guilford Road, and after walking about 300 yards, passes under a railway bridge, and then, very gradually ascending for a few paces, walks along a path which crosses fields. It seemed to me just possible that C might have encamped on these fields, but very to the last degree unlikely. The only suitable camping grounds that I can see anywhere are those mentioned above. 16902. Walked over the cliffs from St. Margaret's to Walmer. After walking for a short distance along the edge of this rampart south of Walmer Castle, I struck inland along a fence and came to a path which traverses a rolling chalk plateau and runs exactly in a straight line with the tower of St. Mary's Church, Walmer. There is splendid camping ground on this plateau. The camp would have commanded the approaches from every point of the compass, and the descent from the plateau on the west or landward side is steep. Beyond the valley which bounds the plateau on this side, the ground rises again fairly rapidly. The plateau extends northward to a point just south of Walmer Castle, which it commands. If Caesar encamped on the plateau, the camp could be discovered by excavation. But if he encamped on the gently rising ground northwest of the plateau, the camp could not be discovered, for this ground is covered by buildings. I assume, of course, that he did not encamp on the high ground west of the plateau or on the ground on which the windmill stands, for both sites are too far from the sea. 17.902. Addenda. Page 122. There was certainly a Copper Age, Ireland. Professor Gowland Jern, Anther, Inst, Roman 36, 1906 pp. 26-7, deprecates the use of the expression Copper Age, remarking that the so-called Copper Age possesses no characteristics which are not common to the Neolithic Age, except the imitations and limited use of stone forms and metal, and see the question seems to be purely verbal. Page 140. It is worthy of remark, not pure. The proportion of lead in Scottish bronze implements appears to have been remarkable, but Professor Gowland Jern, Anther, Inst, Roman 36, 1906 p. 30 observes that lead is found in small quantities in nearly all bronze implements. See, however, J. Evans, Ank, Bronze Implements, p. 417. Page 148. All the open ones, sand. Professor Gowland Jern Anther, Inst, Roman 36, 1906 p. 36, affirms that molds of sand or loam were undoubtedly of later times, as there are considerable mechanical difficulties in preparing them. Page 194, Note 3 to the list of counties in which drinking cups have been found must now be added Kincardineshire, Proc, Soch, Ant, Scott, XL 1906 pp. 346. Page 205, Note 4, to the list of papers on cup and ring markings may be added Proc, Soch, Ant, Scott, XL 1906 pp. 318-27. Page 208. Stone circles, Kincardineshire. A circle in Stirlingshire is described in Proc, Soch, Ant, Scott, XL 1906 pp. 301-4. Page 211, Note 2, to the list of papers on Scottish stone circles may be added Proc, Soch, Ant, Scott, XL 1906 pp. 164-206, 245-54. Page 221. They told him, ankle bones. This statement rests upon the reading letter 1F00, sigma tau rho alpha gamma letter 1F71 lambda omega nu in deodorus siculus, v. 22, section 2 Professor Ridgway, Folklore, I 1890, p. 83, N1, suggests that the true reading may be letter 1F00 sigma tau rho alpha beta letter 1FF6 nu, Saddles. Page 237. Choral, later period. M.S. Rianich, Rev. Arch, 4 E. Sayer, Roman 6, 1906 pp. 309-10, argues that the development of enameling in Gaul was due to the growing dearness of coral, the price of which rose because large quantities were bought for exportation to India after the conquests of Alexander the Great. This view leaves unexplained the continued use of coral in Britain long after it had fallen into disuse in Gaul. Page 259, Note 3, in a recent article on vitrified forts Proc, Soch, Ant, Scott, XL 1906 pp. 136-50, Lute Call. A. B. McCarty suggests that some of them may have been built in the time of the Vikings and argues that the vitrifaction was probably never intentional because, 1, in various forts. The loose stones below the vitrification, sic, are supported by ordinary masonry, which apparently might have been carried up the whole way had the builders so desired. And 2, the greatest amount of vitrifaction is generally found where a strong parapet is least needed. He also thinks that the forts were used for signaling and that the vitrifaction was produced by smoldering beacon fires. Page 288, Note 1 Canon Greenwell, in a paper to which I have already referred, p. 676, N6, states that in the Danes' graves, by far the larger number were laid on the left side, and about 1/3 had the head pointing to northeast. It does not seem, however, he adds, that the dead were laid with the face turned towards the sun. He also observes that the presence of charcoal in close proximity to an unburnt body, so universal a feature in the graves of the Bronze Age, was not noticed except in a few cases, at the Danes' graves, and in these it may only have been there accidentally. Page 379, Note 3. I omitted to mention Professor Carl Pearson's method of estimating stature. Dr. Beddoe, who has criticized it in Jern, Roy, Inst, Cornwall, Roman 15, 1902, pp. 160-371, thinks that it probably underestimates the stature of tall men, and observes that in one case, where the actual height of living men had been ascertained, Professor Pearson's calculations erred considerably more than his own or M. Manovriers. Page 408, Note 4. See also Biometrica Roman 3, 1904 pp. 243-4. Page 490, Note 5. Further evidence of tin mining in the Scilly Islands will be found in Memoirs Geol. Survey the Geology of the Isles of Scilly, 1906 pp. 10-11. Pages 504-5. Is he not aware, distinguished? C. Muller, in his edition of Ptolemy's Geography, p. 106, argues that Pliny's Vectes cannot be the Vectes which was the Isle of Wight, because he mentions it among the islands between England and Ireland. But if this argument is sound and Pliny did not blunder, it remains true that there is no evidence in Pliny or any other writer for identifying Ichthys with Vectes. Page 527, Note 9. Mr. Spurrell has proved that a slight subsidence has taken place in the London district since the Roman occupation. See also p. 566, supra. Pages 580-13. There is one passage, anchorage. The argument in this paragraph depends upon the assumption that the ships which were carried back referenter in 55 BC to the port from which they had started were laid to, and that they could not lie within less than 4.5 points of the wind, or if with Falconer and James Smith we allow 6 points for leeway, within less than 2.5. It may not perhaps be impertinent to explain that when a ship is laid to her head is brought as close to the wind as possible without losing way, under little sail. In these circumstances, the helm is often lashed, and the ship then has a tendency to yaw, that is, to fall off the wind and come up again alternately. An experienced seaman with whom I have recently discussed the matter believes, however, that it might have been practicable for the captains of the ships in question to adopt the plan of head-reaching. That is, working to windward under comparatively low sail, but still enough to enable the steersmen to keep the ships under control, to luff up to dangerous seas, and to make considerable headway. As he remarked, the difference between lying to, when the helm is not lashed, and head-reaching is simply one of degree. In head-reaching, the vessel carries a little more sail, and judging from illustrations of ancient ships, he thinks that Caesars would have been able, when head-reaching, to lie within 2 points of the wind. Allowing 5 points for leeway, he holds that they could have made good a course within 7 points. And he insists that an ancient ship with its sails properly trimmed could have gone as near the wind as a modern lugger. This, I need hardly say, is rank heresy, and I do not believe that anyone who is conversant with the literature of ancient navigation will accept it. Besides, we do not know whether Gallic ships were rigged exactly like those of the Mediterranean. James Smith, The Voyage and Shipwreck of St. Paul, 1880, pp. 75, 127, 215, may or may not have been right in maintaining that an ancient ship could not make good a course in moderate weather within less than about 7 points of the wind. But numerous passages prove that ancient ships, if they could work to windward, could not do so without difficulty. If my heretical friend is right, why were Caesar's cavalry transports windbound in the ulterior portus, less than 8 miles from the port which their captains wished to make, and why were they obliged by contrary winds to put back, even in moderate weather, after they first started from the ulterior portus? M. Jules Vars, indeed, L'Art Nautique dans l'Antiquité, 1887, pp. 181 ff. Apparently doubts whether ancient ships could work to windward at all, but a passage which James Smith quotes from one of Cicero's letters, fam. Roman 14, 5, section 1, cum sane adversus ventis usi essimus tardec, et incommode navigassimus, and another in Livy, which I am obliged to quote at second-hand hinc ad ventos obliqua transfera vila suggest, if they do not prove that they could. I hope to discuss the question soon in another place. Meanwhile, it is enough to say that if Caesar's cavalry transports could not work to windward, they could neither head-reach nor lie to, and those which were carried back to their port of departure must have fetched it by sailing with the wind nearly abeam. But those which were driven down in great peril to the lower and more westerly part of the island, ad inferiorum partum insuli qui est propius solis, occasum magno suo, cum periculo deserenter, were evidently scudding. And while the word referenter, were carried back, which is strongly contrasted with deserenter, suggests that the others were laid to, Caesar's words show that they were comparatively in little danger, though if they had not been brought close to the wind, they would evidently have run as great a risk as the others. A distinguished admiral suggests to me that they did sail with the wind nearly abeam, and disposes of the question of danger by assuming that Caesar exaggerated its force. But with due deference, I would ask whether, since it was strong enough to drive ashore and wreck ships which were riding at anchor, and since the ships that ran before it were in great peril, ships sailing with it nearly abeam would not have been in peril equally great. It is universally admitted that ancient ships could sail with the wind abeam. It seems hardly credible that the discovery should not have followed that Gallic ships, which were not shallow, could also make headway within less than 8 points of the wind. And I therefore believe that, however rare, from one cause or another, tacking may have been, ships were occasionally laid to in bad weather. Anyhow, my argument remains unshaken. If the ships which were carried back to the ulterior portus neither lay to nor head-reached, it is self-evident that they could not have fetched Sangat, and therefore that the ulterior portus was Ambleteuse. If they sailed with the wind abeam, they could not have fetched any port east of Wissant. If they were laid to, they could not have fetched Sangat, nor could they have done so even if they head-reached, unless they possessed a capacity for working to windward with which few modern ships and no ancient ship can be credited. Indeed, they could not have done so even then, for it would evidently have been impossible for them to beat across the channel in a single tide. The flood, CP 583, would hardly have helped them, and the ebb, prolonged and strengthened by the northeasterly gale, would have carried them far out of their course. The foregoing remarks apply of course to other passages in which I have mentioned the cavalry transports. By no means could they have returned either from near Hythe or Lympne to Ambleteuse or from near Pevensey to the mouth of the Authie. Page 680. Therefore, unless Beckesbourne, Mr. George Barrow of the Geological Survey, whom I have consulted, thinks that there is no reason to suppose that the relative level of water and banks in the Little Stour above Littlebourne was appreciably different in 54 B.C. from what it is now. Page 698. The claim, better grounds. Mr. F. H. Baring, Eng, Hist. Reverend October 1907, pp. 726-8, argues that Caesar crossed the Thames by an undoubted ford just above tidewater at Hampton, which was mentioned by Lord Lumley in 1685. He argues that, owing to the tides, Brentford would only have been available for 5 or 6 hours out of 12. That this important fact would surely have been mentioned, and that the stakes which have been found at Brentford are 15 inches round and therefore too large. I am not sure that he is referring to the stakes described by Mr. Montagu Sharp, whom he does not mention, but surely the stakes would not have answered their purpose worse for being strong. I do not believe that Caesar would have mentioned the presence of tides at Brentford if they had not affected his passage, but, as we have seen, p. 696, Mr. Spurrell has argued that the tides did not reach Brentford. If there was a ford at Hampton before the days of locks and weirs, there was another, if the evidence of the name Halliford is trustworthy, at or near Koway stakes. Are we entitled to assume that either existed in the time of Caesar? The reader will have understood that I do not pin my faith to Mr. Sharp's theory. I only think that it is less feebly supported than any other. Page 712, Note 2. W. Sternkopf, Hermes, XL, 1905, p. 37, rejects Boot's emendation, Proximus, and conjectures that Cicero wrote Proxime, meaning that the letter in question was the most recent of several which had arrived together.